The China in Africa podcast is brought to you in partnership with the Africa-China Reporting Project at Wits University in Johannesburg. The ACRP promotes balanced, considered reporting on China-Africa relations through training programs held throughout the year. More information at africachinareporting.com.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the China in Africa podcast, a proud member of the Sinica Podcast Network. I'm Eric Olander, and as always, I'm joined by China Global South's managing editor, Cobus van Staden, joining me for another few weeks from beautiful Berlin, Germany. A very good afternoon to you, Cobus.
Good afternoon.
Cobus, last month, the United States government released another one of its henny penny, the sky is falling reports about China, this one about media. And it's been a long time since you and I have talked about Chinese media in Africa and other parts of the world. And in part because there was a big push in the late Hu era, the Hu Jintao, who was the previous president to Xi Jinping. And then Xi Jinping came into office, and a lot of the CGTN, Xinhua, China Radio International, remember in South Africa when the China Africa Development Fund purchased a 20% stake in Independent Online, and there was this big push for media, and it kind of stopped. But that doesn't mean that Chinese media, influence operations, disinformation, propaganda, whatever you want to call it, isn't moving forward. It's just taking a different shape. So let's get started in our discussion today looking at this State Department report. We're not going to dwell on it too much, but it does give us a baseline to talk about both Chinese media around the world and a little bit in the great power competition, how each other are framing one another. So this report came out last month on September 28th, How the People's Republic of China Seeks to Reshape the Global Information Environment. Let me read you a few highlights of it, just to give you a sense of the tone of what they're saying. The PRC employs a variety of deceptive and coercive methods as it attempts to influence the international information environment. That is one of the opening lines of the report. They go on to say Beijing's information manipulation spans the use of propaganda, disinformation, and censorship. The PRC spends billions of dollars annually on foreign information manipulation efforts. Beijing uses false or biased information to promote positive views of the PRC and the Chinese Communist Party. At the same time, the PRC suppresses critical information that contradicts its desired narratives. This is the tone that goes on for quite some time. Let's take a listen now to the man who organized this whole project, James Rubin, who is the special envoy and coordinator of the State Department's Global Engagement Center.
We're pleased to release this first-of-its-kind report on PRC information manipulation. It's a comprehensive look at how the PRC and the Communist Party of China attempt to distort the global information space to advance its geopolitical objectives. When you look at the pieces of the puzzle and you put it together, you see a breathtaking ambition on the part of the PRC to seek information dominance in key regions of the world. On issues the Chinese government deems sensitive, the PRC has employed online and offline intimidation to silence dissent and encourage self-censorship.
And for those of you who are not familiar with the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, that's the department that started back up, I think, around 2016, that's tasked to confront what they call malign actors. That's basically French for Russia and China. So that's what James does, or Jamie. And then this whole report then, not surprisingly, sparked a flurry of discussion in D.C., particularly in the think tank world. And let me just give you, again, a sample of what was being said. This is Jamie Metzel, who is a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Many years ago, he was a bigwig at the Asia Society, and he was speaking with Michael Holmes over at CNN, who asked him about this report.
Chinese propagandists, like Russian propagandists, are poisoning the free flow of information in our open societies. We've already seen the threat that poses to American democracy. We've seen misinformation around the issues of the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic. And what they are basically trying to do is to poison the well of global accountable information and to create an environment where there is no fact, where there is no real accountability. And if we don't want to live in that Orwellian world, as Jamie Rubin rightly pointed out, we have to call this by its name. We have to be honest about what's happening. And we need to develop response mechanisms that do what needs to be done, countering misinformation and harmful propaganda without undermining our own open societies.
Cobus, it's a little bit weird to be hearing somebody talk about that. And again, I'm not going to take anything away from what the State Department was saying about the Chinese, and we're going to find out today how much of what they said is true or not true. But let me just read you a Washington Post headline, okay? Trump's false or misleading claims total 30,573 over 4 years. The biggest problem in the United States today is not misinformation from the Chinese as much as the Global Engagement Center or Jamie Metzl would like to portray that. It's Facebook and Twitter and social media platforms that have no regulatory oversight to control the flow of mis and disinformation. And so I think the framing of this as if we are some virginal society that has free flow of information and here come the Chinese to spoil it just feels a little bit odd to me, to be honest with you. But when you hear this, what's your take, both of the report and also from the stakeholders who were commenting on it?
It's a kind of a mixed bag, because on the one hand, one does know that there is organized information management and messaging coming out of Beijing. Like obviously the Chinese state media is very active, and what we've been covering over last years, kind of the kind of media that isn't acknowledged to the state media, but it is placed and it ends up kind of like in like feeding into information ecosystems. But that seems to be, I mean, I still wonder how effective that actually is as a kind of a massive shaper of perceptions of China. And the one example of that is the perniciousness of the debt trap narrative, which the fact that the debt trap narrative just ends up living with us permanently somehow is, I think, proof of how much more powerful narratives about China coming from Western countries still remain than the ones coming from China. But more broadly, like it seems like, as problematic as Chinese media influence can be, it's happening in a much more problematic context, which is a general kind of like post-truth kind of like breakdown of facts, in which, you mentioned the Trump era. Obviously, former President Trump was a big player in that particular field. But I think also we're at a moment where kind of disinformation and, different kinds of manufactured information, seeming non-information is so rife that it's sometimes hard to realize, to actually track what is actually happening in the world. Like the discussions that happened on Twitter/X and Facebook and so on, like around the violence in Israel, has been a great example of that, where sometimes you're like, I literally don't know if this is true or not, or even realistic to think about or not, or, like there's so many different kind of like hard takes and like talking points and outrageous stories kind of like popping up at, per minute on those platforms. And they're so clearly not being moderated that, like whatever kind of disinformation is coming out of China is just part of a bigger river of disinformation that's kind of flowing around the world. And that seems to be our bigger problem.
Well, let's get a perspective on this, because I think it goes beyond your or mine ability to really understand the breadth of this. But we wanted to talk to somebody who's been studying this for years. And Dani Madrid-Morales is one of the leading scholars on Chinese media in Africa and in other global South areas. Dani is a lecturer in journalism and global communication at the University of Sheffield. He's been on our show a couple of times, but way back in the day. This is the first time that we've had a chance to speak with him since he moved across the pond to the UK. Dani, thank you so much for taking the time out of your schedule. It's wonderful to have the chance to speak with you.
Thank you for having me, Eric. It's wonderful to be back and having a chance to have a chat with you and Cobus about some things that we've talked about in the past, but they seem to be resurfacing again, right?
Yeah, we want to kind of update everybody on what we talked about in the past. And this issue has been around for a long time. The Global Engagement Center put out this report. Now, to be fair, the Global Engagement Center is not a nonpartisan institution. It has an agenda. How much of what you saw in that report was true, and how much should we question it? I mean, help us understand where this report fits in terms of our understanding of what the Chinese are actually doing in Africa and around the world.
Probably the easiest way to go about this would be to say that nothing in the report is false. It's just the way it is framed. It might be presenting a much more darker picture than what's actually happening. To rewind for a minute, right? As you were discussing with Cobus a minute ago, a lot of what it's included in this report, which is that the Chinese Communist Party is trying actively to engage with global public opinion and trying to influence it in a way that public opinion sort of goes towards China's side. That's a reality that nobody can deny or can hide. So in that sense, the attempts by Beijing to influence the information space are a reality. They have been happening for a long, long time. They've been happening in Africa in its more recent expression for the last 10, 15 years, but also they've been happening since the 40s, 50s, 60s, when global external propaganda was a massive part of what the Maoist regime was doing, right? So there's nothing new there. But at the same time, I guess the most important part here will be to say, well, the US has been doing very similar things across the world for equally or even, if not a longer time. The question then is, how do we distinguish what it is that we can determine as malicious and what is it that it's not malicious? And that then it becomes a very complicated question to differentiate. And Cobus was making a very interesting point, is that this report comes in this current environment where we keep hearing that there's some sort of disinformation disorder where we don't know what's true and what's not. And that comes both from domestic actors and also from international actors. And it's in this space that we have to understand this document, where there's some officials in Washington and even in Brussels, in London, and in a few other European capitals that are starting to panic about the possibility that the monopoly that the so-called West had over global narratives is weakening. And in that weakening of that space, Beijing is taking a bigger role.
So, Dani, I wonder if you could give us an idea of how much has changed in China's approach to media. Because when I read these reports, and I obviously, you know, as someone who's been in this space for a while, and particularly also focusing on media narratives for a while, you know, one does read these reports when they come out. And this one struck me as very similar to reports that I've been reading like 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 5 years ago. And you know, kind of with a strong focus still on Chinese state media and a lot of kind of talking points that one would pick up in Freedom House reports, for example, and you know, over the years. So has there been a concrete kind of shift in approach to communication from the Chinese government, or have they basically been chugging along since they set up in similar ways since they set up the Xinhua operations in Africa in the early 2010s, for example?
That's an interesting point, Cobus. My first reaction to this report was a bit of, so what? Or what's new, right? There was nothing really new. If you had been listening or watching or following the media space by China, there was nothing really new in that report. But what to me was striking about this report, and I'll come to your question about what has changed, is that China hasn't significantly changed its way of engaging with the rest of the world through the media. What has changed is how the rest of the world is seeing this. We've seen a switch in how European capitals, the Washington and so on, are starting to have concerns about this. So when we discussed some of China-Africa media engagements back in almost like 10 years ago, there was absolutely nobody that would care about our conversations, or very few people would care, right? And you would see almost a disregard of all of China's efforts to engage in the African media landscape. And now that has switched very quickly to the point where a lot of discussion is going on in diplomatic circles, in governmental circles, and I've been part of some of these discussions in DC, also in Brussels, where we start to hear a lot of more talk about what should we do against this, or what should be our actions to counterbalance some of these activities. Now, what's interesting here is that very little has changed in how China engages the rest of the world through the media. Obviously, we've had CRI and Xinhua and CGTN going on for more than 10 years in Africa, for example, but they were there much before, right? Like if any of the listeners are old enough to remember, there was CCTV9 and there was CCTV4 and so on, and CCTV News. So there's been all these channels that have been going on for a long, long time. And that hasn't changed much. If you look at the coverage of CGTN Africa today, as it was 10 years ago, there's been a sophistication in the methods, but a lot of the narratives are the same. There hasn't been a significant change. What probably is most interesting is all the other things that the CCP is doing to try to influence this information space. And it's in those other spaces that things are becoming a bit more creative and a bit different. And probably the reason why some of these other foreign powers are trying to ring the alarm bells is that it's this other set of activities that might have a bigger impact. You said that before, Cobus, that it's probable that CGTN having a large presence on Africa and the African media landscape doesn't have a really significant impact on public opinion locally. But there's a bunch of other activities that might be having a lot more impact.
Well, let's delve into some of those activities. The way that I frame this and kind of lay it out so it's understandable, think about it as above the line and below the line. So above the line is what we see. That is Chinese media such as China Radio International, as you pointed out, Xinhua, even sometimes People's Daily and CGTN. These are all the visible media outlets that we see not only in Africa, but also in the US and in the Americas and elsewhere. Then we have the below the line. And the below the line, again, as you pointed out, is where a lot of interesting things are happening. And I'd like to list a few of the different activities and then get your take to expand on whichever ones you want. So the most notable and the one that gets the most attention are these things called the content sharing agreements. And that's where Xinhua will go to an African media outlet and they will say, listen, we understand that times are tough today. The advertising revenues are down. It's expensive to afford AP and Reuters. We will give you free of charge a feed to Xinhua. Do with it as you want. You don't have to publish anything. We'll give you photos, we'll give you pictures, everything free of charge. What ends up happening is that content feed oftentimes gets plugged into that African newsroom and through automation is updated on the website and then also distributed onto social media platforms. Oftentimes journalists will do what they normally do with other wire copy. They'll take it and they'll rewrite it and they'll put their own name on it. And about 90%, this is my amateur guess, Dani probably has a better sense of it, about 90% of Xinhua's content is totally benign. Stock market closings, Biden met this person, she did this today. It's about that 10% though, that is where they talk about Xinjiang, COVID-19, Taiwan, a lot of those red line issues, and a lot of that filters through. So those are the content sharing agreements. Then there are the junkets where they bring over thousands of journalists and content influencers over the years to China for these tours. Those are very effective, surprisingly effective. We also have where they are providing equipment to local media outlets in Ghana. The Ghana News Agency just signed a new deal with the Chinese embassy. It's interesting, that announcement, we featured it on the site, was the political attaché at the embassy signed the deal with the head of the Ghana News Agency, really highlighting that it's not a media-to-media relationship, it's a political-to-media relationship. Also, there's media infrastructure, where the Chinese are rebuilding broadcast facilities, digital transmission, other initiatives like that. They have paid media, where they will literally sign long-term contracts with newspapers to publish articles from the ambassador and whatnot. And according to a number of experts, they also use those contracts as leverage when, say, the United States or Taiwan or somebody that they don't like wants to also buy media or be featured. They say, if you run this, we'll pull our contract. So a lot of the newspapers then go, oh, we don't want to lose money. Sorry, anybody who wants to challenge China, we're not going to feature your paid content. So there's a lot of these different initiatives. Those are all the things that Dani was saying that we don't see. Those are below the line. Dani, why don't you pick it up from there and talk to us a little bit more about the tactics and the methods that are being used below the line? How effective are they? And is this something that should worry rival governments in, say, Asia, in the US and Europe?
So you've made an excellent list, Eric, about some of these things that are happening. What's interesting about some of them, I'll pick a couple as examples, right, is the sophistication that the CCP has developed in some areas. So if you think about content sharing agreements, for example, and you explain very clearly what they are, what we are seeing now is how through these content sharing agreements, larger amount of content that originally is written maybe in a newsroom in Beijing gets what some people would call, it gets laundered, right? So there's some information laundering going on where the original source of that article disappears, and then it's presented to audiences as if it was coming from a local journalist or a local news organization. And some of these agreements, the very original ones, might not include some clauses, but we see some newer ones. You talked about before about IOL and how there was involvement by Chinese investors in acquiring a percentage of IOL being this independent group in South Africa that publishes a large number of very influential newspapers. So as part of that content agreement, for example, IOL has a branch, a news agency, a local news agency. A lot of the content that Xinhua shares with this news agency, ANA, gets published as it was coming from the local news agency. And that's that kind of activity that masks or hides or prevents users from knowing where the information is coming from. And those are important. Another thing that's interesting that's happening increasingly more and more is seeing a lot of the content that comes from CGTN, for example, broadcast on national broadcasters. And we've seen that happening in a few African countries for a while. For example, in Kenya, for a long, long time, KBC, the Kenyan state national broadcaster, has been showing CGTN sort of at prime time on KBC One around 10 p.m. every night. But in other countries, we've seen that in Liberia, CRI has similar agreements on radio stations. In Lesotho, for example, 4 hours a day, there's content from CGTN. Lesotho national broadcaster leaves 4 hours a day for CGTN content. And what's interesting about some of these agreements is that those used to be spaces that were occupied or were used or they were taken by former colonial powers or European powers. Right? BBC, CNN, and other global powers were the ones providing some of that content. But now the Chinese are coming in a mix of arrangements. You were mentioning before that a lot of the Xinhua content is provided for free, which is true. What's interesting about CRI and CGTN particularly is that they are now paying some of the broadcasters to get their content on air. So, for example, before some broadcasters would go to ABC and say, oh, can we use some of your content? And BBC would say, sure, no problem, you can use it. Now it's CGTN officials that go to some of these countries and say, hey, we are offering you money to have our content. And therefore, that helps also with the economy of scale of amplifying some of these narratives. Something that I was noting when you were listing some of these activities, right, is what's interesting to me is that the gap that has emerged between some of the activities that are happening in Africa, in many African countries, and what's happening elsewhere in the world. So if you look at some of the activities that are listed in that report that we were talking at the beginning of our conversation, what's happening in Europe, North America, are a lot more covert operations, right? So there's attempts to influence public opinion in more malicious ways. So either through silencing voices, where there's a lot of pressure on certain groups that might be anti-China, and there's efforts by the CCP or operatives around the CCP or the United Front to stop those voices from speaking up. But those activities, we don't see them really on the African continent. And I think that that's the interesting part here, how there's been a barrier that's been built between activities that are happening in countries where public opinion might be more leaning against the Chinese state. And in Africa, where there's a generally favorable public opinion, China has been going on with what's been working so far okay for them. And there's all these activities. And there's no need for most officials in those African countries, Chinese officials, I mean, to engage in some of these other darker, we could say, methods to influence the information space.
And just continuing on that theme, these kind of like darker, more social media and other forms of influencing, which issues are they particularly kind of cohering around? I assume that, kind of just from following press and over the while, I assume that like Xinjiang would be one and COVID origins might be one. But like, what are some of the kind of main issues that they tend to focus on?
That's a very good question, Cobus. I think one of the biggest changes that we've seen, and if any of the listeners is a frequent observer of CGTN Africa, for example, they'll probably would have noticed that if you look at the content that CGTN Africa was producing 2012, 13, 14, 15, and you look at it now, one major change is the increasing amount of anti-Western, anti-US content or narratives that we see in the broadcast. Africa Live, right, that 1 hour show that is produced every day from Nairobi by CGTN Africa, is increasingly adopting some of the macro narratives that Beijing is trying to promote of the hypocrisy of Washington, the double standards of the West, and some of these anti-French, anti-Western narratives that we see in West Africa, in French-speaking West Africa, for example. Those are things that we did not see so much a few years ago. And that's probably the interesting part, how somebody in Beijing has come to realize that maybe the more propagandistic messages that China used to present through CGTN and other means might not be resonating well with audiences. Obviously, you can take as much as you can of a new project that's being developed by a partnership with China and so on, and a new dam that's open, a new road that is open, a new project that starts. But there's so much that you can cover on this, right? But all of these other macro narratives, this idea that the West is in decline, that the West has been having a negative impact on the African continent for a long time, are resonating a lot better, partly because they are true, right? But also because there's an audience that's willing to have those conversations, right? That for a long time they were muted. If you look at how CNN covers Africa, there's no engagement with these critical readings of what the US military has done in Africa for a long time. Those are absent from those discussions. But there's all discussions about what are the possible negative consequences of China being on the continent. So CGTN, RT, TRT, and some Al Jazeera and so on are spaces where these conversations can be had. And that marks a significant departure from what CGTN originally was thought in the last years of Hu Jintao, of it's a propaganda machine of what China is doing in Africa, as opposed to a tool to reshape the conversation around the geopolitics of global engagement with Africa.
Cobus, you seem to have forgotten my famous acronym for the red lines for China. And every chance I have to take it, I'm going to take it. So, Dani, I don't know if you've heard my acronym to remember all the things that China doesn't want to talk about on its media. Okay, let's go. And it's getting longer, by the way. 4THKXJCSCS. Okay? Okay, here we go.
Okay.
Taiwan, Tibet, Tiananmen Square, the party. There's your 4 Ts. HK is Hong Kong, C is COVID-19, XJ is Xinjiang, and SCS is South China Sea. That is your mnemonic device to remember all of the things that are basically red lines, no-go zones. If you want to, really piss off the Chinese, you talk about 4THKXJCS. I can't even do it anymore. But
but the reality is, Eric, is that, to be fair, even for me as a Spanish person, I don't care about most of these issues, right? So the audiences that might be watching CGTN, or they want to tune into Star Times and watch something that's on Star Times, they really honestly don't care much about what's happening in Tibet to some extent, or South China Sea, right? But they do care about the forces that are trying to influence the African continent, and what are the consequences of us having a policy that looks west instead of looking east. Those are debates that they want to have, and those debates are absent largely from the global coverage of Africa, even BBC Africa, right? Which is a very good coverage of the African continent, but oftentimes it doesn't have a space to have these discussions. And CGTN and RT and so on are offering those spaces, and that eventually can be a lot more impactful than, again, talking about a new festival that China is having in Cairo for some sort of purpose.
Now, back in 2018, you and University of Cape Town professor Herman Wasserman did a study of Chinese media consumption, or ratings, if you will, in several of Africa's largest countries. And it's really the first study that's ever been done to determine, is anybody actually watching this stuff? And back in 2018, you found that not many people were at all. And I'm wondering if you've had a chance to update that study, or have any sense as to whether or not Chinese programming on television in particular in many African countries has either gained or lost popularity.
So we recently rerun some of that study. That study overall showed that in the largest English-speaking countries, or the allegedly more influential English-speaking countries, Nigeria, Kenya, and South Africa, very few people were watching CGTN or listening to CRI. Like, you were talking about figures, anything between 2% and 10% in the most generous spaces. So we redid that study recently, as a continuation of that project of trying to understand audiences. And we conducted at the end of last year another public opinion survey in Angola, Ethiopia, South Africa, and Zambia. And as you can see, we've picked slightly different countries, going to areas that we don't know much, like Portuguese-speaking Africa, for example. And the conclusions were the same, right? So we asked people, in the last 7 days, did you watch CGTN? And we listed a bunch of other broadcasters, for example. And to give you some figures, and in Angola, 3%, in Ethiopia, 10%, in South Africa, 5%, and in Zambia, 5% said they had watched CGTN in the previous 7 days. So those are very small figures. And if you want to see how small they are, you can compare them to the BBC, where in Zambia, 60%, South Africa, 45%, even in Angola, 23% of people said that they had watched BBC, or they had interacted with BBC content in the previous week. So Cobus mentioned that at the beginning, right? And he said, I don't even know if there's any influence of these activities on public opinion. And probably the conclusion is that they have very limited impact. And we've talked about that before, and there's some people who have made this distinction between sort of the upper and the lower spaces of Sino-Africa connections. And probably in the upper sectors, that is government officials, elites, and so on, some people might be influenced by the content that they see on CGTN and so on, but it's not the everyday user. There's very little engagement with, or intended engagement with, some of these efforts that China has. And that's why it's so important to look at these below the line efforts that you mentioned before, Eric, that it's in those spaces where the influence might happen. But also, and something that we've been working on lately, is to remember that the reason why there might be some acceptance of some of these meta-narratives that Beijing is trying to spread across the world is maybe not so much because of the effort that China is doing. It's not because they're active on social media. It's not because they're active on other spaces. It might be because some of those narratives connect very well with other historical and cultural and political issues that have been going on the ground for much longer. Right? And that connects with what I was saying before about this anti-Western, anti-imperialistic, anti-French sentiment that's been there for a long, long time and for a reason. And we've seen the Russians do it before, and now the Chinese are increasingly doing it a bit more, which is if you tap into those narratives and you connect your narratives to those where you say, well, as opposed to the US and its military massacres that have happened across the continent for a while, we are not doing this. That resonates a lot better than saying, oh, here's another road, or here's another bridge, or here's another cultural center that we open in a certain city, which are great activities. And I don't want to downplay the importance of those engagements, but they don't have a massive impact on how people perceive other countries.
I was thinking along very similar lines. And, like I remember, soon after the UN vote on Ukraine happened, there was a lot of discussion from, in Western media about, this reflecting the success of kind of narrative building from China or Russia, in Africa. And I was wondering to which extent it actually just reflects pre-existing kind of issues with Western power in Africa, not that only that vote specifically only, but as you say, Dani, like these narratives have been around for a long time. And, to a certain extent, Chinese media is kind of piggybacking on them rather than necessarily creating them from zero. So I was wondering like how you think about that. To which extent is being critical about the West or Western influence just simply still talking about the West and having the West kind of dominate the kind of mental horizon of discourse in Africa? And to which extent are we seeing something new emerging? Something where China really is starting to shape a kind of a discursive agenda?
Probably would be very ambitious to say that China is really being able to shape a new discursive agenda. And it's more about what you said. I think it's a very interesting point, Cobus, about just putting the West in front of a mirror. That's enough to activate certain psychological mechanisms in people's brains, right? So if you look at, and there's a few really interesting examples of how RT, and I'm going to go through RT because it's a bit of like the model that China is trying to aspire to in some ways, or CGTN at least. If you look at how RT has been covering the US for a long time, it's been doing very good journalistic work in some way. It's just been focusing obviously in certain aspects and hiding others. And some of these aspects are racial relations, for example, which has been for a long time one of the subjects that both Russian and Chinese propagandists have liked to highlight when it comes to the US, but also double standards that the US has in the international scene, or issues around huge income gaps in American society, or huge disparities between coast and rural areas, for example. But by just covering those issues and giving a space to journalists to research those stories, to talk to people, to do stories and packages that reflect some of these contradictions in the image that we get of the US in certain places as opposed to what might be happening really on the ground, is enough to present yourself as a sort of an ally in this rearrangement that's happening globally of where each country sees each other, who are the friends and who are the enemies. So to your point, right, it's not so much that China is really being very creative in how it presents the West or how it presents itself in relation to the US, but it is using its resources, and it has plenty of resources to use that infrastructure that it has in place through channels, content agreement, and so on, to talk about the US in ways that we don't often have other media talking about. And with that itself, it is already offering an alternative worldview that might be very attractive to certain young people and not so young people that have seen that their views of the world did not match with what they would see on CNN and other international channels. And in that area is where there's an effectiveness of this message. One can wonder whether it's a true feeling, right? Where those writing those stories have truly an interest in uncovering some of these power imbalances that happen in American society, or is it purely a Machiavellian thing where I just want to portray the US in the most negative light because that's going to make me look better? We could get into that debate and probably we will never find an answer there, but that's a very significant shift. And again, if anybody watches CGTN Africa, you'll see that some of those stories are increasingly appearing on the show when they were not part of the core messaging back in 2012, 13, 14, when the channel was starting.
Help us put what the Chinese are doing and what was outlined in the GEC report and the research that you've done over the years. Help us put it in some context. How much of what the Chinese are doing is exceptional and unique, and how much of it is really quite standard public diplomacy statecraft? I mean, the Chinese have CGTN and the Americans have VOA. And I know the Americans, they love to say that VOA is not like CGTN, it's independent journalism. If you read read VOA, you're not going to believe that. Nonetheless, how much of what we see going on here is really just part of modern statecraft in the 21st century? And the Chinese are just being called out by the Americans, but at the end of the day, the French, the Germans, the Japanese all do something to the similar effect. Or are the Chinese really outliers and more assertive than others?
That's probably the trickiest question you've ever asked me, Eric, but let's try. So I'll say a couple of things. One, if we look at specifically at the case of Africa, only Africa, I'd say that there's very few things that China does differently than the rest, right? You said VOA, you have BBC, you have France 24, RFI, and so on. Now, what's different, obviously, is the context behind these media organizations. And as much as VOA is a tricky example, and VOA is not particularly popular anywhere in Africa these days, there's a editorial independence that happens in some of these other international organizations like Al Jazeera or France 24 that doesn't exist with CGTN.
Yeah, I mean, I was the former editor-in-chief of France 24's digital, and not once in my 3 years that I was there did I ever get any directive on coverage. Not once. We could do anything we wanted.
That's a significant change, right? And sometimes some people forget that, right? That there's this independence, that it's very important. Now, what I think it's interesting in the case of China is the breadth of the presence that it has. And we haven't talked today about something that we've talked about before many times, which is Star Times, this privately owned company, but has a very significant governmental support. But then you also have all the activities of all the consulates and diplomats and the social media presence and the content agreements and the movie co-productions and all of these other ecosystem of activities. That's very unique in the case of China. So that's one difference. The second difference, and it doesn't apply so much to the context of Africa, again, because maybe the CCP doesn't feel the need to do this, but there's a new set of activities that are not so much focused on disseminating China's message, but are there to suppress anti-China messages. And those, we see them very much so in Europe, in North America, in many Southeast Asian countries, but we haven't seen them in Africa, mostly because those and the strongly well-publicized anti-China voices are not there in most African countries. But those activities are what probably would differentiate, say, the US, Europe these days, right? If we think about the Cold War, obviously, or pre-Cold War era, the US was very active in silencing dissenting voices, but that's not the role that the State Department has or the CIA has these days. But China does that very actively in European capitals, right? Cobus is in Berlin, and there's many colleagues in Berlin that work for think tanks that have been under direct attack, constant attack by actors in the orbit of the Chinese state. So those are differences that exist. But if you look at it from an African capital, right? So if I'm looking at it from Maseru, there's limited difference between what VOA is trying to do and what China is trying to do. Both of them are trying to portray its message in a specific way, promoting its values and its own understanding of the global order, just using different tools. And in the case of China, spending a lot more money than the Americans are.
So, Dani, in some of your more recent work, you've also started looking at Chinese media influence building in Latin America. And I was wondering how that is, like what you've noticed and how that's different from Africa.
There's some very interesting developments in the context of Latin America. For example, I'll give you a couple of examples that have happened recently, one in Brazil and one in Cuba. In Brazil, we saw the development of this new partnership between Chinese media and a established private broadcaster in Brazil to create a program called Mundo China, China World. And this TV show, it's a co-production between the Brazilian broadcaster and Chinese media, has reshaped in many ways the information ecosystem around China in Brazil. There was a very interesting study that anybody listening might want to have a read by a scholar by the name of Pablo Morales, who's at the London School of Economics, where he looked at what was the consequence of this partnership that was built around this TV program called Mundo China. And what it showed is that by having this type of partnership, again, it's not CGTN broadcasting in Portuguese directly to Brazilian audiences because there's no such arrangement. But with creating this program, it shifted the overall tone of news coverage of China. It introduced in a well-established private broadcaster a space to talk about China in a very specific way. And that specific way is very positive of China and rarely any criticism. And we've seen that recently, just 3 or 4 months ago, there was an announcement that CMG, right, the China Media Group, which is this new meta group that was created by merging CRI and CGTN and others. So CMG had an agreement with one of the local TV stations in Cuba called Canal Caribe to create a new program called Contextos, which is a partnership, again, a weekly show, 30 minutes, all China news. And all of these new activities go into what Eric was suggesting before, right? All these under-the-line partnerships. There's still the presence of CGTN in Spanish, for example, in the Latin American space, and it is relatively popular. It has a well-established network of correspondents. It is competing with RT, which is also quite popular in the Spanish-speaking world, but it's also going into these other areas where we've seen China do it before in many African countries, and now we are seeing it expanding its presence in Latin America, where, again, the public opinion is somewhat also quite favorable.
Dani Madrid-Morales is a lecturer in journalism and global communication at the University of Sheffield, and clearly one of the smartest voices out there when it comes to China's media influence and presence in Africa and obviously elsewhere throughout the global south. Dani, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. If people want to follow the work that you're doing and what you're reading and writing these days, what's the best way for them to stay in touch?
Probably follow me on X. That's where we still are. We don't know for how long, but dmadrid_m, that's where they can find me.
Okay, I'll put your X handle in the show notes. Once again, Dani, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you so much, Eric. Thank you, Cobus.
Cobus, Speaking with Dani is one of these shows where you wish you had a 4-hour podcast. You know, you wish you could be, like Joe Rogan and just go for as long as you want, because I had so many other things I wanted to talk to him about. We never brought up the issue of TikTok. And when we talk about Africa, I mean, TikTok is just enormous. And let me just give you a few statistics here. That in Kenya, we're looking at 54% of online users use TikTok for various purposes, and almost 30% use it for news only. In South Africa, your home country, 50% of users engage with TikTok for general content, 22% use it as a source of news. So if we think that TikTok is a new major arena for information, both disinformation, misinformation, and legitimate information, the United States refuses to participate on TikTok because it's owned by ByteDance, a Chinese company. That's a space and an arena that's all Chinese. And so I wonder if the Chinese are just walking away now with these new spaces, such as the content sharing agreements, TikTok, some of these other initiatives that the West doesn't have an answer for because their bureaucracies, their systems are so firmly anchored in traditional legacy media, not in new digital media.
I think that's a very powerful point, and I think probably true. I would love to see more research on what the kinds of Chinese and non-Chinese and anti-Chinese kind of messaging is on TikTok, because TikTok is such a kind of a wild frontier, so it'll be interesting to see a kind of a breakdown of the China-related stuff that people in Africa catch on TikTok, and to which extent they're mostly catching African stuff on TikTok. Because I think for what is interesting, I think in all of these media discussions, because this is our particular framing, we're always looking at China and something, we'd end up talking a lot about how China is framed in this discussion, but in African kind of media platforms, the big action, this big space of action is for Africans to represent themselves to themselves. So there's the creation of new African images of Africa. So it'll be very interesting to see whether Chinese framings of Chinese things kind of get a voice in there, and what the kinds of pro-Chinese messaging is on TikTok.
Let me just shift gears a little bit back to something that Dani talked about. He mentioned the China Media Group, and this is a very important organization in this broader debate. And the China Media Group, again, is this umbrella organization that houses CGTN, China Radio International, a number of Chinese media entities. Very similar, by the way, if you're familiar with the way the French do it. There's something called France Média Monde, which, again, is RFI and France 24, and I think France Télévisions is all under that umbrella. So again, in so many ways, what we see the Chinese doing is not that exceptional. They're copying in many ways the structures and methods of other powers as well. But something that we showcased on our website last year in an article by Angela Lewis, who back then was a PhD candidate at the International Communications Department of Nottingham University in Ningbo, China. She wrote a fascinating piece that I share all the time, and talking about the state-to-state media relationships that China does in Africa. And she talks about the Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation. We've talked about Ghana News, SABC as well. And she talks about rural populations in particular. So urban populations are oftentimes very well connected to the internet, to mobile phones, and get lots of different information sources. But in rural communities, oftentimes state broadcasters is the only media that people get. And that's not just true in Africa, that's in many parts of the world. And so when China does these deals with state broadcasters like KBC, the Kenyan Broadcasting Corporation, typically then the narrative about China tends to be very positive. And you think to yourself, okay, well, who cares if people in rural countrysides across Africa have a positive view of China? That seems like a rather esoteric topic. But Cobus, you and I have talked about year after year after year on this show how around election time, China oftentimes becomes a contentious domestic political issue. But if there is no fertile ground in the countryside, and that's where a lot of politicians go for votes, whether it's Iowa or Ohio in the United States or into rural Kenya around Lake Victoria in Kenya, the countryside and the rural communities play a very important political role. And so if China is taken off the table or seen positively, then that actually has some considerable domestic impact as well. So these state-to-state broadcasting relationships that oftentimes get overlooked because they target rural communities and outdated state broadcasters, they have real, tangible political influence.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something I think that's very easy to overlook, particularly because a lot of people tend to focus on urban and youth, constituencies. So it's a really important issue. What I also wonder is whether we're going to see, how can I put it, like a kind of a narrowing or a kind of a convergence of Chinese messaging across all of these different platforms, or whether China is, because, in a lot of ways, what we've been covering, through this whole conversation is quite a kind of a scattershot approach, right? Kind of a little bit of this, a little bit of this, a little bit of, kind of like social media influencing in Europe, sort of state media in Africa. It's, in general, it's also a kind of a scattershot combination of trying to suppress anti-Chinese messages and trying to boost quite bland, positive images of China. So I wonder if all of this is going to cohere at some stage into something that's presenting a more unified image of China, or if the scattershotness of it is kind of the point. Kind of if the idea.
I think that's a feature, not a bug.
Yeah.
I think it gives them a lot of flexibility. The more that they centralize this, the less maneuverability that they have. It's a little bit like the Belt and Road we've talked about. The fact that there is no Department of the Belt and Road is one of its biggest strengths because it's malleable. It can adapt. It can do anything it wants. And so you're going to see it in Africa manifest one way, Latin America another way, and then here in Southeast Asia a different way. And in many respects, again, we didn't delve into the United Front as well. And the United Front is another important part of all of this because the United Front targets overseas Chinese populations, diaspora networks, ethnic communities. That changes the dynamic for media engagement as well. And so I think it changes quite significantly depending on region and how much ethnic Chinese diaspora there is. And so having it not centralized is probably better for them in the sense that they become more adaptable. More centralization bogs them down into bureaucracy is my guess.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, we're looking into a black box, right? I mean, no one really knows for sure. And I also think that people often tend to give the Chinese more credit than they deserve. A lot of this is very uncoordinated. It's not very strategically thought through. We oftentimes overlay a layer of strategy that doesn't exist and a level of coordination. A lot of times they're just like, okay, we're going to do this, we're going to do that. And then we look at it all together and it looks like, wow, that's a Picasso painting. In fact, it's just splotches on the wall. And it's not always as coordinated as they're given credit for. But nonetheless, I think they're formidable. There's no doubt about it. And my honest opinion, and I'll make this my final thought, is I think they're outplaying the West. I think they're outsmarting the West. I don't think the West has the answers. I don't think they have the bureaucracies that can respond. I don't think they have the creativity. And I think there's a certain arrogance that still exists in many parts of official Washington, Brussels, London, and Berlin that says our soft power, our cultural soft power, is still vastly more powerful. We don't need to respond, with our own content sharing agreements. We've got Beyonce. But I don't think what a lot of these people understand is that just because you smoke Marlboros, wear Levi's, drink Starbucks, use an Apple phone, that means you're going to align yourself with American political values or, democracy or like the United States anymore. It's the old story that in China, somebody protests at the U.S. embassy and then goes around the block and lines up for a student visa. Those two can exist together side by side. And so that idea of soft power, that everybody wants to be like us because we've got Beyonce, I think that's a little bit dated in some respects. I think, Beyonce in many ways and American cultural exports are kind of globalized to the point of meaningless now. It's a little bit like Starbucks. You go to Starbucks everywhere, or McDonald's, it doesn't feel like an American brand anymore. It just feels like a global brand. And so it loses some of that Americanness, if you will.
It's also, I think, that like all of the power of these brands, the power of American media and so on can't be taken away from the full landscape of American power. And so, just because people drink Starbucks doesn't mean they forget about the complicated relationship they have with the US, Like in the end, the prominence of Europe and the US in Africa is both an asset for Western powers and a liability, because everyone has very strong ideas about them. Everyone is quite up to date about what they, what they feel are their hypocrisies or their double standards or what they feel they're doing wrong. That's a sign of power, right? So,
but there's no doubt, as you brought up at the beginning of the show, it's unquestionable that American discourse power remains preeminent. There is no doubt that the narratives that show up in AP and Reuters, and we are fighting this all the time in our climate coverage, trying to elevate and amplify African voices in the climate discourse, and how difficult we're finding that to be, in part because global North narratives are so dominant. So they still have bullets in the chamber in the form of discourse power. No two ways about that. And China's discourse power is considerably less, no matter what they do with their content sharing agreements and whatnot. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's a political advantage to the United States, because oftentimes that discourse power is turned against the United States. But you can see the power of Western media still being quite formidable.
Yeah, absolutely. The thing is, kind of so frequently what is framed by Western stakeholders as Chinese messaging or Chinese discourse power ends up being, when you actually come down to it, a referendum on Western power. It's like, Western power, yay or nay, that still ends up framing the discussion in many parts of African societies, I think, fundamentally.
Well, speaking of new media initiatives, I want to let everybody know that we have launched our new YouTube weekly show called the CGSP Roundtable. Today, we recorded the show and we featured our correspondent in Jerusalem, Johnny Essa, also our editor in Jakarta, Antonio Timmerman, and as well as Giraud, our Africa editor from Mauritius. And we just talked about the week's stories, and it was a great conversation. So we're doing this every week. We're not going to do it next week because I'm going to New York to attend the next China conference put on by the China Project, but I'll be back the following week when we'll kick that off again. Looking forward to Cobus giving you a full report on the next China conference and what people are talking about. This is the high and mighty of China watchers in the US who will be there, so I'm very excited to have the chance to mingle with them. And, I feel like I'm that guy who, they had that Holiday Inn commercial a couple years ago of like a guy launching a space rocket. And they're like, do you work here? And he's like, no, but I slept at a Holiday Inn last night. And that's kind of, I feel like when I'm around these bigwigs in the China watching space, because it's a lot of fun. But go over to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/China Global South. You'll see our shows. You'll see all the great work Jenga is doing on climate. Also, Giraud is there. Our podcasts are there if you'd like to watch and listen to our shows there. So we hope that you'll subscribe as well to our YouTube channel. It's obviously free. And then if you would like to do a deep dive on any of these issues and to find out all the great work that the team is doing, go over to ChinaGlobalSouth.com/subscribe. Your subscription helps support independent journalism. I cannot say how important that is in this day and age. And as Cobus mentioned at the top of the show about what we're seeing coming out of Israel, this is the time when you need human-created news and human-centric news. I know that sounds weird to say, Cobus, but we are in an era now where AI and bots are just filling the landscape. And if you're one of these people that says, I'm not going to pay for news, there's enough out there on X and on social media, you're deluding yourself. You're deluding yourself because figuring out what's real and what's fake now is incredibly difficult. And you can see that even the president of the United States is getting kind of sucked into these memes with the whole Hamas-Israel war thing. And he supposedly has a $30 billion intelligence service at his disposal. So it's hard. So we have 10 people on our team who are pouring through this every day. And if you're trying to figure out what China's doing in the world, then your $19 a month investment is well spent. And it's supporting independent, human-centric journalism, nonpartisan journalism as well from the Global South. All of us live in the Global South. Most of us are from the Global South. Not me, but Cobus, Giraud, Johnny, all of them. So we would love for you to join us. If you are a student or a teacher and you're predictably broke, as most students and teachers are, we have a 50% discount for everybody in the academic space. Just email me, eric@ChinaGlobalSouth.com, and I'll send you the discount links so you can get that half off discount. So let's leave it there. For Cobus van Staden in Berlin, I'm Eric Olander. We'll be back again next week with another edition of the China in Africa podcast. Until then, thank you so much for listening.
The discussion continues online. Tag us on Twitter @ChinaGS Project and visit us at ChinaGlobalSouth.com. If you speak French, check out our full coverage at projetafriquechine.com and AfriqueChine on Twitter. That's Afrique with a K. And you'll also find links to our sites and social media channels in Arabic.